Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to our Story of God series. Today, we're breaking into the story of Scorpio. Just take maybe 15 seconds to sketch where we've been so far in this particular study. In the very beginning, we did an introduction where we looked at Genesis, the first two chapters in the story of creation, and then we went into the very first Mazzaroth sign, which was the story of Virgo and the Abrahamic covenant. And of course, over the last month or so, we've been talking about the story of Libra and the Mosaic Law. Excuse me. Now, as God's story continues, the next chapter is represented by the Mazzaroth sign of Scorpio. Let me just show you this. This is what the eastern sky from Jerusalem looked like at sunrise a few days ago on November 24th. You can see the feet of Virgo at the top there in the middle. And the sun is just at the transition point as it rises between the scales of Libra and the tip of the claw of Scorpio, the scorpion. And that was about 6:30 in the morning when the sun breached the horizon. But as you see the video there scrolling forward minute by minute, you can see Scorpio coming into full view. Notice how the Mazzaroth signs, these constellations, are moving up and to the right from our point of view. That's moving west and slightly to the south. And this is what is called the ecliptic. If you remember from probably, I think it was the very first lesson we did in the introduction, we talked about how the Earth is tilted about 23 degrees on its vertical axis. And that makes it appear as if the sun and as it rises and the constellations as they move across the sky, it makes it look like they're going, kind of up and around us rather than directly overhead. And that's mostly because of that ecliptic or that tilt in the vertical axis. Now, what will happen over the next several weeks as we continue to go through the time period that is, probably the word governed isn't the right word, but during the time period when the sun rises in the constellation of Scorpio, is instead of the sun rising in the tip of the claw, it's going to get close to the head, then it's going to rise in the body, and then eventually the tail. But in just a couple of weeks, actually, what's going to happen is the sun is going to begin to rise in the constellation of Sagittarius, the archer, and that is the story of Joshua conquering the Promised Land. Of course, we'll get to that once we finish the story of Scorpio. So what is Scorpio all about anyways? The short of it is, and I know that most of you know this because you've either read Tim's book, The Mystery of the Mazzaroth, or you've been with us back a couple of years ago when we did the Mazzaroth study locally here in Tampa. But basically, it's about the story of Kadesh Barnea, about how the Jews refused to go into the Promised Land and they rejected God and His promises, and God rejected that particular nation. And I'll have a few things to say on that coming up here in a second. But I want to start with the big picture and the crux of the matter, and then we're going to drop in and pick out a few key stories that occurred during this particular time in the history of God's people. So the big story is this, right? The Jews left Egypt in the Exodus. And during the time of Exodus was, of course, when we saw the first Passover. Then they took 49 days or 7 weeks exactly to reach Mt Sinai. And that 49 days or that 7 weeks is the time period between Passover and Pentecost. And that interval became known as the Feast of Weeks. And you see that phrase used a couple of times in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. But of course, during their time at Mount Sinai, it wasn't just the one event where God came down on the mountain and gave the law. They spent an entire year at Mount Sinai where God met with Moses on a pretty frequent basis. The Jews made the Ark of the Covenant. They made the Tabernacle of Meeting. They made the altar, the utensils that were to be used in temple service, the priestly robes, and God instructed Moses on the daily sacrifices as well as observing the feast days and more. And all of this is chronicled through the books of Leviticus as well as the book of Numbers. That year in Mount Sinai seems to have been relatively uneventful. Lots of instruction, lots of building. But after that, at some point, God said, hey, get up and start moving. And He moved everyone to the northwest into a region that is actually southwest of Jerusalem, what later would be known as Jerusalem. But they went to a place called Kadesh Barnea. It's referred to just simply by Kadesh a couple of times in the Old Testament. And this is where the actual event of the rejection and the rebellion, what we refer to when we talk about this Kadesh Barnea. This is where and when it happened. And we're going to, I don't know if I'll get to it today, and if not today, we'll certainly cover it in a different lesson, but we'll talk about that. That's in Numbers 13 and 14 if you want to read that on your own sometime in between now and then. But of course, the story is bigger than just that one event. It's bigger than the act of the rejection. And I want to backtrack just a little bit because, while the story of Scorpio is about the people rejecting God and then God rejecting that specific generation, these people had actually rejected him many times before they had refused to go into the promised land, didn't they? I want you to go to Exodus chapter 33. Now we're going to read a few things here and there in the book of Exodus, and it's not going to be entirely sequential. So there are going to be a couple of things I read that are just a verse or two long, so I'll probably not have you turn there. But do go to Exodus 33. The context is this. The Jews had arrived at Mount Sinai. They had experienced the terror and the horror of God showing up in fire and smoke and lightning and thunder on Mount Sinai. They heard him speak out the Ten Commandments. Then God had called Moses up to write the Ten Commandments on the first of two sets of stone tablets. So this is right after Moses comes down from the mountain. He's got the stone tablets, and he sees the people worshiping the golden calf, and he's so angry he throws the stone tablets to the ground and he breaks them. So Exodus 33:1, the Lord says to Moses, "Depart and go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it." And I love this particular verse because many times throughout the Bible, God reminds his people he was the one who brought them out on eagle's wings and delivered them. But what does he say to Moses here? He says, the people that you brought out. He says Moses was the one who had done that. And it's not a blame game or anything, because in the context, it's because these people are behaving very, very badly. I think it's more like an unwillingness to yet take ownership for this group of people in this particular nation that he had formed. God was certainly locked into the Abrahamic covenant, but as we see later, he's got some flexibility over which generation of the descendants of Abraham he actually uses to drive the covenant forward. He was certainly obligated to bring out the fourth generation from Egypt. He had said that specifically to Abraham when he foretold the 400 years of bondage. He said that they would 400 years of affliction, but then he said he was going to bring the fourth generation out. And let's talk about the fourth generation that had gone into Egypt. And so we know that God is not a liar. He had to bring these people out, regardless of how obedient or disobedient they were or were going to be. He made a promise and he fulfilled that promise. But notice what he says in verse 2. He says, "And I will send my angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanite, the Amorite, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusite. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go with you. I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." Now, God is obviously expressing his deep displeasure and his disfavor here. He's frustrated with them. And to protect them, in reality, I think that's exactly what he's doing. To protect them, he says, instead of going himself and running the risk of getting so angry that he consumes them, he's going to send an angel or a messenger, like in the Septuagint, it's angelos, the angel messenger that we interpret it depending on the context. But, he says, just so that I don't destroy you, I'm going to send my angel with you. In verse 4, when the people heard this bad news, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments, for the Lord had said to Moses, "Say to the children of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people. I could come up into your midst in one moment and consume you. Now, therefore, take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do to you." And the Septuagint there says, actually, I will show you what I will do. So it changes the wording just a little bit. So the children of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments by Mount Horeb. And of course, that's just the other name by which Mount Sinai was known. Now, we've often taught that these stories of early Israel are much like stories of how a strong and a good parent manages a young and a willful child. At this point, the nation of Israel was a baby. It was a fledgling nation. This particular generation of Jews knew only bondage. That's all they knew. They were born into it. They lived their lives in it. And they only knew stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They only knew stories about Joseph. Joseph was dead at this point. And they really didn't know the God of their forefathers. They certainly didn't know him personally. They didn't know him intimately the way that Moses was beginning to know him. They had much to learn about the world. They had much to learn about themselves as individuals, as a collective, and they had much to learn certainly about God himself. And even before they got to Mount Sinai, we saw the complaints of, we're thirsty and we're hungry and you brought us out here to die. And maybe knowing that they had such little experience with God himself, maybe we can excuse some of their early transgressions and their rebellion. And certainly the Bible shows plenty of evidence that God was very, very patient with them. And, stories like this just reminds me the way that they were disobedient, even in the midst of all the great things that God had done and how he had shown himself. It reminds me of what Revelation 20 says of the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ, how the devil was going to be set free for a time after the 1,000 years to deceive the nations and to gather them together for war to fight against Christ. And in the way Revelation describes it, it's not a small army. It uses, if I remember correctly, terminology like they numbered as the sand of the sea, kind of like the way that God spoke to Abraham about how his people, his descendants, would number in a huge multitude. It always blows my mind that any mortal living during the millennial kingdom that person could be swayed and deceived to fight against the King of Kings, who's living and ruling in the midst of Jerusalem. But then I remember stories like this and others in other books of the Bible and other stories of Mazzaroth, where the nation of Israel, even after they had an extensive personal history and experience with God, they went astray, they rebelled, they rejected him, and they did it, time after time after time. And we're still in Exodus right now, but when the Jews got to Mount Sinai and they made the golden calf, they rejected the promise simply because Moses was gone too long. It seemed to be the only trigger. And they immediately turned to what God had just told them not to do, because when he came down on Mount Sinai and he spoke out the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 verse 2, and you can turn there while I read if you want to. He says, I'm the Lord your God, Exodus 20 verse 2. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And he goes on and talks about how if there is generational disobedience, he will continue to deal with those generations, and he uses the terms like, or a phrase like, of those who hate me or of those who love me. I want to point one thing out since we're here. I know that there are some Christians and some pseudo-Christian groups that don't believe that you should, for example, wear a cross or have pictures or iconography or anything like that, because they point to this verse and say that you should not make for yourself a carved image. But in verse 4 and 5, it makes it very clear that you're not supposed to make any representation of what's in heaven or earth for the purpose of worshiping it, either worshiping it because you think it represents the God that you serve, or because you're a pagan and you're worshiping what Paul in Corinthians tells us are demons. That's not the point. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a sticker with an ictus on it, or having a cross, or whatever the case is, because we don't worship those things. These are merely symbols that point us to bigger stories, much like the constellations and the signs of the Mazzaroth themselves. But, you and I can't forget that the Ten Commandments are the backdrop against which God is judging this particular people. Everything that they're doing, everything that they will do, is going to be compared to the first set of rules that God had given them, which is the Ten Commandments. And I think it's relevant to point out that if God had rejected, or if he did, which he does, and if he does reject these people, he was in no way reneging on the promises that he had made to Abraham. He was being very selective as to which generation of Jews, which generation of Abraham's descendants he was going to use to make a great nation, because that was part of the promises he made to Abraham. I will make you a great nation. Well, which group of descendants was he going to do that? Was he obligated to do it with the first generation? There was no stipulation in the contract, if you will, that actually said that. But it begs the question, because, truth be told, while the nation of Israel was born with this generation that came out of Egypt and received the law under Moses at Mount Sinai, that nation wasn't all that great, unless you simply define great as being the size of the population, which I don't think is exactly what God was meaning. He wasn't saying, and he did say in many places, your descendants will number as the stars in the Milky Way or the sand of the sea. But he wasn't just saying that a great nation was a nation that had a lot of people. He was talking about the greatness of the nation. In this particular group, they whined and they complained all the time. I would argue that the Jewish nation didn't become great until perhaps the time of David and Solomon. But even after that, it was hit and miss, and it was largely downhill until God eventually, cut off Jeconiah and basically took the king off the throne. And, the story of David and Solomon, that's, Capricorn, and then the splitting or the Babylonian captivity, and that's the story of Aquarius. And we'll get there and we'll paint those pictures. But I want you to notice this. If you know this part of the story in Exodus 32 and 33, you know that this is the beginning of a full year that they spent at Mount Sinai. And so after Moses breaks the first 2 stone tablets, one of the first things God said was, get up and move, go. He didn't say, oh, hang out for another year. He actually told them to move. And then in Exodus 32, right at the end, as we go into 33, Moses prays for the people, and he actually offers himself in their stead. But in the end of Exodus 32 and verse 33, he says, no, I'm not going to take you as an atonement for the people. Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. Now, notice what Moses does next in Exodus 33, verse 7. Moses took his tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the camp, and called it the Tabernacle of Meeting. And it came to pass that everyone who sought the Lord went out to the Tabernacle of Meeting, which was outside the camp. And so it was, whenever Moses went out to the tabernacle, that all the people rose, and each man stood at his tent door and watched Moses until he had gone into the tabernacle. And it came to pass when Moses entered the tabernacle that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked with Moses. All the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose and worshipped, each man in his tent door. So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. And he would return to the camp, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. So the first thing to note here is that the first tabernacle of meeting, the first temple, if you will, was Moses' own tent. It said that he took his own tent and went out and pitched it outside the camp and called it the Tabernacle of Meeting. And that's where Moses met with God for the next year, in his own tent, sometimes up on the mountain. As we will see, it took a year for the Jews to make everything that they would need once they did start to travel and go to the place that God would show them. But in the meantime, Moses' own tent served as the tabernacle. It was called the Tabernacle of Meeting. Let's continue in verse 12. Then Moses said to the Lord, see, you say to me, bring up or lead this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found grace in my sight. Now, Moses is always looking for help, right? When God called him from the burning bush, he said, I can't do this. I can't talk. And God said, well, your brother Aaron's pretty good. I'll let you, he'll be your assistance, and you can lean on him. And, we see Joshua being, maybe his protege. And here he's saying, like, when you tell me to go, like, you haven't told me who's going to come with me, right? And I think that this is part of Moses' makeup. And I don't know that it's a lack of confidence. Certainly that could be part of it, but we're told a little bit later in the book of Numbers that Moses was an incredibly humble man. And, maybe there's a fine line between humility and a lack of confidence for some people. Well, remember that God had said that he would not go with them, lest he become angry at their stubbornness and consume them. He said he was going to send his angel. Now look at what he says. So Moses again says, you haven't told me who you're going to send with me. Verse 13, now therefore I pray, if I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way. And the Septuagint says that Moses said to him, manifest yourself to me, that I may know you and that I might find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. And he said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And the Septuagint here says, I will go along with you. And so remember that when God was upset with the people, he said, I'm going to send my angel because I'm so angry right now. I'm afraid that if I go with you, I'm going to end up destroying you because of your stubbornness. But now he relents. Moses intercedes and Moses pleads to him. And he says, you haven't told me who's going with us. And God finally says, I'm going to go with you. Maybe his anger had cooled. Maybe because of Moses' intervention, God was willing to relent. And this is really, I think, what we see. We see him relenting from his anger. And this is, quite honestly, it's another example of the pre-incarnate Christ, having his own emotional reactions and working things out along the way. And we've talked about this concept several times in this particular series, that the Son appears to not have been begotten with all knowledge and all experience, right? He was learning himself. Verse 15, then he, being Moses, said to the Lord, if your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here. For how then will it be known that your people and I have found grace in your sight, except you go with us? So we shall be separate, your people and I, from all the people who are upon the face of the earth. And here's the crux of the matter and the reasons why the people ultimately failed at Kadesh Barnea. God's presence is what makes a people and the assembly separate and different from the rest of the world. Without the presence of God, we're nothing. And Moses knew that. The people didn't seem to get it, but Moses did. So, you and I, we have to ask ourselves, have we, in our fellowship, have we created an assembly and a fellowship environment, a koinonia? Have we created this environment that God is willing to be present among us? And we can look at it as a collective, but we also can look at it in terms of our personal life. Are you whining and complaining like the Jews were, even in the midst of God showing himself in very powerful ways? Are you stiff-necked and are you unappreciative? Right? And this is just some food for thought. A short while before this, in the story, the people had shrunk away from the Lord when he appeared on Mt Sinai, and they were terrified when he spoke out the Ten Commandments and the display of his power. And basically, they put Moses in between. They said, we're terrified. You talk to God and come and tell us what he said. And so they kind of created Moses as the mediator. And of course, God was okay with that. But I wonder sometimes if the cost to the people was perhaps a loss of a degree of intimacy with God. And this was part of the problem. They weren't willing to get close, even though getting close means getting close to something that is potentially, terrifying, as they had experienced. And, I think Moses' statement back in verse 12 about God knowing his name, and the statement that Moses makes here now in verse 17 supports this idea. So verse 17, so the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing that you have spoken, for you have found grace in my sight, and I know you by name. Now, how and why had Moses found grace in the sight of God? And it was simply through obedience. It was despite his reservations, despite the apparent insurmountable odds of the things that God had asked him to do. Go back and convince Pharaoh to let my people go. Take this staff, take your brother, I'll give you the words. Part the Red Sea. I mean, it was just, throw a piece of wood into poisonous water and it's going to become okay. And, I'm going to feed you by raining down this thing called manna. And it certainly doesn't mean that Moses was perfect. We continue to see Moses making mistakes, even though he's got this tremendous connection with with God himself. But, here's the rule: spending more time with God and growing in the knowledge and the wisdom of the Lord, and acting on that. Because a lot of people study, but it doesn't change them. But acting on that, it puts you into God's good graces. It gives you favor, and that's a nice place to be, especially when God asks you to endure something that is difficult, or do something that seems to be a huge obstacle, or face an enemy or a giant, if you will, that appears to be unconquerable. Do you remember our series we went through last year? I think it was, or earlier this year. Sometimes it takes a mountain. What does it take to get your attention and to have you turn to God and not turn away from him the way that these Jews did? Oh, that sounded terrible, but these Jews in this particular story. But notice Moses' reaction here. He wants more, right? This is what happens when you go deep. You want to go deeper. So in verse 18, Moses, in the midst of all this, he says, I can just see him, and I can see the passion. He's like, and he said, please show me your glory. In the Septuagint, the translation is, manifest yourself to me. Then he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no one shall see me or see my face and live. And the Lord said, here is a place by me, and you shall stand on the rock. So it shall be, while my glory passes by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and will cover you with my hand while I pass by. Then I will take my hand away. I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. So here's a question. The Septuagint says, manifest yourself to me. But hadn't Moses already seen the Lord? Hadn't he seen him in the burning bush on Mt Sinai? He met him up there and spent time with him. Verse 11 says that God met Moses face to face and spoke to him like a friend. So why does Moses say, show me your glory, or show or manifest yourself to me? And I think the answer is that he desperately wanted to see God's true form, not the shielded form of the fire in the burning bush, or the pillar of cloud that appeared at his tent, or the form of a man that had appeared to Abraham outside of Sodom and Gomorrah. Somehow Moses knew that there was more to the Lord than he and Abraham had been allowed to see, and he desperately wanted to see it. And God said, no, not a good idea, because you can't see that and survive it. So God shielded him. In fact, that's exactly what happened in Exodus 34. So go to Exodus 34. We're going to begin in verse 5. What happens is God tells Moses, because Moses broke the first set of commandments, he tells him to take 2 more stone tablets and said, get some more tablets and meet me up on the mountain. And so the next day, Moses does that. Now, before we read here in verse 5, I want you to know that a lot of people miss that this is the pre-incarnate Christ that Moses is talking to. They say it's the Father, it's not the Son, but notice how God here in Exodus 34 is proclaiming the name of the Lord, and he's speaking about the Lord in the third person. In fact, the Septuagint here says that God called out in the name of the Lord. Clearly, he's extolling the virtues of the Father, and he's not bragging about himself in the third person, because he says this, or this is what it says in verse 5. Now the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with Moses there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So Moses made haste and bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped. Then he said, if now I have found grace in your sight, O Lord, let my Lord, I pray, go among us, even though we are a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and sin, and take us as your inheritance. Notice here, not just the fact that it is the pre-incarnate, it's the Son talking about the glory of the Father, right? Notice that Moses is interceding for the people. And there are a lot of parallels here in this particular passage, as well as others, between Moses and Jesus, right? Verse 28 tells us he was up on a mountain for 40 days with no food and water. That's parallel to, Jesus and, 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. Moses was the first lawgiver, and the law was given on a mountain. Jesus was the second lawgiver, and in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7 gave his own 10 commandments. And there in verse 9, Moses said, and notice this, he said, if I have found favor in your sight, go among us and pardon our iniquity. He's pleading for God on the people's behalf, and he's saying, if you're okay with me, extend that to the people around me. Moses was asking for God's favor, his favor on one man, to be extended to a group of people that were connected to him. And Christ did the same thing, right? But notice how Moses ends verse 9 here. He says, take us as your inheritance. And I can't escape the very specific wording here. And it makes me wonder exactly what God was sharing with Moses as he was meeting with him in the tabernacle of meeting. Was it more than just, make the priestly robes like this, design the tabernacle like that? I think it was. I think he was instructing him on aspects of his plan, and much like some of the other prophets like Daniel, where he's told, shut up the words until the end. And, some of the prophets, and certainly Moses was a prophet, where they were told things that they didn't write down. They did not reveal. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, this is all great, but this has more to do with Libra than it does with the story of Scorpio. Well, not really, because if we continue in verse 10, this is the statement of the Mosaic covenant, and of which the law is a part. Verse 10, and he said, behold, I make a covenant. Before all your people I will do marvels such as not have been done in all the earth, nor in any nation. And all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. And in this section here really is the link to Scorpio, because the fact that when they rejected God at Kadesh Barnea and they refused to go into the land, it was on the heels of several previous rejections and rebellions. It wasn't the first time, and it was in the context of God having proven his willingness and his capability to provide for them. And most recently, having said to them, I will go with you personally, and I will drive out your enemies. In reality, this generation had absolutely no excuse, no good reason to reject the promised land and the protection of God. We can't just look at the story of Scorpio as an isolated event without understanding what led up to that point. Had this been their first hiccup, or had God not proven himself over and over, going back to the plagues of Egypt and the Red Sea, the story wouldn't be so important. Now, to bring this down to a personal level again, with all that God has done for you in your life, why do you still doubt him? Why aren't you all in like Moses and begging, please show me your glory? Right? The deeper you go, the deeper you want to be. But remember that covenants always have two sides, for the most part, aside from the unilateral covenants that God has spoken. But here's the people's part. If we continue on here, and I want you to remember these words next week when we meet for our Hanukkah celebration, because they really fit into the theme of Hanukkah. In verse 12, take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant. And this is the collective use, not Moses. He's talking about the nation. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst. But you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods and make sacrifices to their gods, and one of them invites you, and you eat of his sacrifice. And you take of his daughters and your sons, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods. Right? This is the part, the responsibility of the people, that if they went into the land, they had to maintain their purity. The rest of the chapter continues with the description again of the Sabbath and the 3 required feast days. And in fact, the fact that God speaks here that about the 3 feast days, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, that they are actually required, shows that he is already pointing towards a future time when the temple would be in a single place and the people would be dispersed to the lands of their inheritance given to them by tribes, and the adult males would have to travel 3 times a year to come to the place where the tabernacle was. But this wouldn't happen for well over half a century when the land was distributed under Joshua. Verse 24, and again, God is saying, I'm going to do this. You follow me, do what I say, and I will take care of everything. He says, for I will cast out the nations before you, and I will enlarge your borders. Neither will any man covet your land when you go up to appear before the Lord your God 3 times in the year. Again, God states explicitly that he's going to drive out their enemies. He's going to protect them. Even when they're not there to protect their own land, God said, I will protect it. So is it any wonder that when God provides for them and he guides them and he instructs them, that when they finally see the promised land and reject it, is it any wonder that God is just a little more than a little ticked off? We're not going to read parts of this, but chapter 35, Moses takes a free will offering for anyone who wants to donate gold or silver or linen and cloth or wood to make the implements of the temple. Chapters 36 through 39 describe all the items that were built and made over that year that they were camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. I want you to go now to Exodus chapter 40. Exodus 40. I'm just going to read a couple of verses here because, again, this is, just a description of how the temple and all the implements are to be arranged. Exodus 40 verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, on the first day of the first month, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of the meeting. You shall put in it the ark of the testimony and partition off the ark with the veil. You shall bring in the table and arrange the things that are to be set in order on it, and you shall bring in the lampstand, that's the menorah, and light its lamps. You shall also set the altar of gold for the incense before the ark of the testimony, and put up the screen for the door of the tabernacle. And then he continues on. It goes all the way actually down through verse 27, but here's what the tabernacle would have looked like. This is what they traveled with. This is what they worshiped God in. We start here with the curtain enclosure, which has a front entrance placed in it, and inside the courtyard, the initial courtyard, you have slaughter tables where the priest would kill the animals that were used in sacrifice. Then they have the main altar where the sacrifices were burned. Then we have the laver or the basin, which is where the priests would wash themselves and clean themselves. Then we have the tabernacle itself, which has an outer veil, which basically was the entrance to the sanctuary. And then there's an inner veil which divided the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies, right? And so together those 2 veils created the sanctuary. It's also called the holy place. And then the Holy of Holies was called the most holy place. And then inside the sanctuary, you had the table of the showbread, you have the golden lampstand or the menorah, and you had, before the inner veil, you had the altar of incense. And of course, behind the veil, you had the Ark of the Covenant. And inside the Ark of the Covenant was the stone tablets that the law was written on. There was the hidden manna, because if you remember the story of when manna first came down, they gathered some up, and Moses gave it to Aaron and say, stick it in a jar and lay it up against the testimony. And eventually it was placed in the ark after they built it. And eventually the Ark of the Covenant would hold Aaron's rod that budded as proof that he was God's chosen one to be the high priest. And that happens after the story of Kadesh Barnea a little bit later in the book of Numbers. I think it's chapter 17. Go to Leviticus chapter 8 here for a second. Because Leviticus 8 now talks about the consecration of the tabernacle. Once they've got it built, it has to be consecrated. Once the priestly robes are made and the priests are chosen, which basically were Aaron and his two sons, or two of his four sons, because he had four sons. They had to be consecrated as well. So Leviticus 8, and he being, I believe, it's Moses, brought the second ram, the ram of consecration. Then Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the head of the ram, and Moses killed it. Also, he took some of its blood and put it on the tip of Aaron's right ear, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Then he brought Aaron's sons, and Moses put some of the blood on the tips of their right ears, then the thumbs of their right hands, and on the big toes of their right feet. And Moses sprinkled the blood all around the altar. And this is part of that consecration process. Now, there's a ton of speculation in various biblical commentaries on this. The problem is that we see the ritual, but there's absolutely no explanation as to why the ritual is the way the ritual is. I think, and I read probably, 7 or 8, maybe close to 10 different commentaries on this. And they're really, there's kind of a general consensus, which I think is probably accurate. And I think most likely what this represents is that the right side in these ancient Oriental cultures, the right side represents honor, power, and authority. The ear probably represents the need for the priest to listen to and heed the word of God. The thumb on the right hand probably represented the need for the priest to keep their hands pure and to symbolize right action, because the hand is the symbol of doing things. And the big toe probably symbolizes always having your feet on the right path and not straying. That's probably what it means, but we don't know. Maybe it's one of those things that will get answered for us in the kingdom. Now, if you want to read more about the tabernacle and the preparations, just read through the book of Leviticus. In Leviticus 8 and 9, we see the tabernacle that they've made being put up and erected for the first time, the very first sacrifices being made. In Leviticus chapter 9, if you're there, in verse 22, Leviticus 9:2 ends like this. It says, "Then Aaron lifted his hand towards the people." This is after they've done the sacrifices and they've consecrated everything. "Then Aaron lifts his hands towards the people. He blesses them, and he came down from offering the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle of meeting and came out and blessed the people. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people, and fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted, and they fell on their faces." I mean, they were terrified again, kind of like the same way they were when they saw God show up on the top of Mount Sinai. Now, just mention this as a side because it's a very quick story. The two sons of Aaron, who are the priests that serve with him, get excited, and they take their censers and they put fire and incense in it and offer it before the Lord. And they did it in a way that God had not prescribed, and he strikes them dead. He consumes them with fire. And Moses really doesn't even blink an eye, because he was reminded that they were told that you don't do anything, particularly when you're involved in temple service, you don't do anything that's outside of the boundaries, right? You don't write your own stuff. You don't do your own thing. You don't do the right thing your way. You do it the way God said. And Moses, I mean, it just kind of portrays Aaron, as just kind of gone, okay. And then his two younger sons step into the position of priest to serve with them. Now, let's go to the book of Numbers. And I just got a couple more things that I want to share with you, and we'll call this lesson closed. Book of Numbers begins like this. Book of Numbers says, verse 1, Numbers 1:1, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt." Now, just to clarify, this is not after Rosh Hashanah. This is not after the fall calendar or the calendar that begins in the fall, which is the creation calendar. The second month basically is the same month in which Passover happens, right? So we're a year after they came out of Egypt. And he says in verse 2, "Take a census of all the congregations of the children of Israel by their families, by their fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male individually from 20 years old and above, all who are able to go to war in Israel. You and Aaron shall number them by their armies. And notice that word armies and the reference to going to war. And I think God's intent is pretty clear. He's bringing his people to war, isn't he? He keeps talking about, I'm going to go and drive out all these inhabitants of this land of Canaan that we've been talking about. And so he's, let's count up. Let's see how many people we have that can go to war. And there actually is another verse where God refers to the entire nation of Israel as an army. I want you to go very quickly to Ezekiel chapter 37. I'll give you a second to get there. Ezekiel 37. And the context here is that God has brought the prophet Ezekiel to the valley of dry bones to witness a vision of the first resurrection that's going to happen at the end of our age when the Lord returns. Ezekiel 37, verse 10, so I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived and stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. And if you read the next verse or two, God points out that this is the entire nation of Israel. He refers to them as an exceedingly great army. Now, this makes me wonder if God had his people not just making the tabernacle and everything that goes into the temple service, but was he already in that, like during that year that they were in Mount Sinai, was he preparing them for war? Now, I need to be clear because there's absolutely no direct statements to this effect, but kind of if you read between the lines, there might be a possibility. I am speculating. I'm giving you my opinion. When Joshua attacked Jericho, where did the Jewish soldiers get their weapons? We know God gave them the victory, but you remember on the way to Mount Sinai, after the Red Sea, and as they were heading towards Mount Sinai, they complained about thirst and hunger, and they got the manna, and then all of a sudden this guy Amalek, or the Amalekites, they attacked them, and God told Moses to let Joshua muster the men and go war. And Moses was up on the rock, and as long as his arms were up, they were prevailing, and eventually they defeated the Amalekites. They must have had some weapons of war to begin with. They probably had some as they came out of Egypt, but it makes me wonder, when we start looking at God preparing his people to go to war, did he have them making weapons of war and training with them during their time at Mount Sinai? And these are obviously questions that we can't answer. We can only speculate, but maybe that will be answered for us when the kingdom comes, and we'll be able to ask amazing thing, like just the thought that we'll be able to ask these people these things directly. So I had a little bit of a technical glitch there, so I have to switch the work I had done on my PowerPoint. For some reason, didn't save, so it just kind of pick up where we left off there. Where want to go to Numbers chapter 9. Actually, I'm not going to read anything in Numbers chapter 9, but in Numbers chapter 9, God describes how he wants the people to know whether or not his will is for them to stay or to move. And it talks about how the cloud would come down and settle over the tabernacle itself. And God's instructions were that if the cloud gets up and moves, then you're to pack everything up and you're to follow. And remember that God's presence is in the cloud itself. So literally they're following God. And then when the cloud stopped, they were to set camp. They were to set up the tabernacle and then pitch all of their tents. And can you imagine how long it would take to get several million people, because that's what we numbered them at, several million people to pack up everything and get moving. And God gave them very specific instructions. First you break down the tabernacle, and then Judah, the camp of Judah goes first, and he's got this very orderly way for the people to pack up and to move and to stop and set up camp. But it's very interesting in the instructions. He basically says, whether it's a month or a day, a year, or even 2 days, you basically follow me wherever I go. And imagine how inconvenient it is for a bunch of people, like a couple of million people, to set up camp and then 2 days later have to break it down and start moving again. And to me, that basically means that God was teaching them again. It was a different way to teach them obedience. It doesn't matter about whether things are convenient for you or not. When God says move, you move. When he says stay, you stay. You do it because God said so. Let me just show you this. I'm going to go to my Bible software here. And this is Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, because now it's time for them to leave Mount Sinai and start moving. In fact, at the very end of, I'll get there in a second. So it says in Numbers 10:11, now it came to pass on the 20th day of the second month in the second year that the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle of the testimony, and the children of Israel set out for the wilderness of Sinai, from the wilderness of Sinai, on their journeys. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. So they started out for the first time according to the command of the Lord by the hand of Moses. The standard of the camp of the children of Judah set out first according to their armies. Over their army was Nahshon, the son of Amminadab. And then he just continues on and goes through each of the individual camps there. But at the very end of this chapter, at the end of chapter 10, and you can read it for yourself, Moses convinces his brother-in-law, a man named Hobab, or Yobab, depending on which language and translation you look at. But this would have been the sister of Zipporah. It was the son of Jethro, the Midianite priest. He convinces him, he says, listen, if you hang out with us, all the blessings that God gives us, I'm going to give to you. And so he convinces them to come. And at the end of chapter 10, it says that they set out on a 3-day journey, just 3 days, said 3-day journey to find a place to settle down. And now we go into Numbers chapter 11. And there's absolutely no reason to insert a long period of time here. There is no time period other than the 3 days that's specified. And I think we need to keep our interpretation within that. And it certainly fits the behavior. But look what happens in the beginning of chapter 11. Now, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord. For the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. And so he called the name of the place Tabernacle, which means burning, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. So kind of interesting here, right? What we saw is pretty much as soon as they crossed the Red Sea, they started complaining because they were thirsty and hungry. Within a few days of leaving Mount Sinai, they were complaining again. And what were they complaining about? And actually, before I go there, let me say this. See there in verse 11, where it says that the fire of the Lord burned and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. This is the New King James translation. You'll notice if you look on the screen, you see the word some is in italics. That means it's not in the original language. And, basically it was inserted by the interpreters, and it makes it appear as if God burned people. He didn't. It says that the fire was among the people, but it consumed in the outskirts of the camp. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen here, I have the Septuagint, one of the English versions of the Septuagint, and you'll notice here that it says that the fire devoured a certain portion of the encampment, and the Septuagint, the 70 scribes that translated into Greek used a word for barracks or for tents, right? So it's clear that God consumed possessions rather than people. I think that is important. But notice that, what were they complaining about? Well, it says here in verse 4, now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish and the cucumbers and the melons and leeks and the onions and garlic that we had in Egypt. But now our whole being is dried up. There's nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. And so, they start complaining immediately again, and it angers the Lord. And this is why he brought the fire, one of the reasons why he brought fire. But, what God does then, and again, I'm not going to read through it. You can read through this yourself, is God says, fine, if you want meat, I'll give you meat. And so he brings a wind from the sea, and it brings all these quail. And it says that there was enough quail, a day's journey in every direction, north, south, and east and west, a day's journey from the camp. And it says that the depth of the quail was 2 cubits, which is 3 feet, approximately 3 feet. So basically he made it rain birds. And it said that the people who actually caved into the cravings while it was in their teeth before they had even swallowed it, he sent this great plague. And of course, Moses again intervenes and says, no, Lord, and God relented. And the way that that particular passage is written is that the implication is not everybody gave in to the cravings. And it seems like at least some people are starting to understand how it is that the Lord wants to help. But I want you to notice this, and this is the story that I want to get to. I want to have a couple more things, and we're almost done here. So Moses hears the people weeping throughout their families, everyone at the door of his tent. This is in verse 10 here. The anger of the Lord was greatly aroused. Moses was also displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, and get this, like he throws this little temper tantrum. He goes, why have you afflicted your servant, and why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive these people? Did I beget them, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I going to get meat to feed everyone? Everyone's saying, give me meat that we may eat. I can't bear up under all these people alone because the burden is too great for me. If you treat me like this, kill me here and now if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness. And so he throws a little temper tantrum, but he's under tremendous pressure. Like it's unfathomable. It's difficult enough to lead a family, to lead a small group, but he's the head of millions of people, and they're not being cooperative, I guess would be the right word. And so maybe Moses has a little bit of right, and God recognizes this in verse 16. He says, all right, he says, go gather 70 elders of people that are elders, and they're already leaders. And he says, I'm going to take some of the spirit that's upon you, and I'm going to put it on them. And this is exactly what he does here in chapter Numbers 11. And the 70 elders that receive the spirit prophesy. They only do it once. They prophesy. We're not told what they prophesy about, but it was a sign that these people were, approved by the Lord, if you will. So the final thing I want to show you here is in Numbers 12. And this brings us up like immediately before Kadesh Barnea. And it's, it's bad enough when the people in general are turning on you. But in Numbers 12, the betrayal comes a little bit more closer to home. This is his sister and his brother. Numbers 12:1, then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian. You'll notice on the right-hand side, the Septuagint talks about her being a Cushite woman, and that should bring us back to Genesis 10 and the kind of the genealogy of nations that came out of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Cush and Mizraim, they were basically the source of the Egyptians and the Africans, right? So who is this woman, and where is Zipporah? Well, Zipporah really doesn't show up anywhere else after the original stories where we saw them getting married and having kids, and she circumcised her son on the way back when Moses was heading back with Aaron to go speak on the behalf of the people against Pharaoh. I would imagine she died somewhere along the way. It's not confirmed, but then here we see Moses with a different wife, right? Because she was a Midianite, she wasn't a Cushite. So they said in verse 2, has the Lord indeed only spoken through Moses? Has he not also spoken through us? And the Lord heard them. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. Suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tabernacle of meeting. So the three came out. He was angry. Then the Lord came down in the pillar of cloud and stood in the door and called Aaron and Miriam. And when they both went forward, he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He's faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings, and he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? So the anger of the Lord was aroused against them, and he departed. And when the cloud departed from above the tabernacle, suddenly Miriam became leprous, as white as snow. Then Aaron turned toward Miriam, and there she was, a leopard. So basically Moses intercedes again, and God speaks judgment and says that she has to be outside of the camp for 7 days before she can be allowed back in as part of the congregation. This is part of the law that actually governed leprosy, which was given earlier in the book of Genesis. So that brings us from the beginning of the year of Mount Sinai to the end of the year of Mount Sinai, and includes the trip to Kadesh Barnea. And we'll deal with the actual event of Kadesh Barnea and the fallout in the story of Scorpio in a different lesson. My apologies for the electronic glitch, but I'm on a timeline. It's actually Friday evening. I'm in a hotel room here in Maryland, so I figured it would just be better to finish things off this way. So hopefully I didn't confuse you as I made my little transition there. God bless. I look forward to seeing all you guys in our Hanukkah celebration next week. And until then.